Story 1. Developments since then. For those who read that post, I have some good news. About 5 months after sharing my story, my cousin reached out. He had been fired from his job, but he had met a wonderful girl who really changed his perspective. Growing up as an only child to wealthy parents, he never had to worry about school or work. While my sister and I excelled academically, he didn't even try to graduate from high school, as his family connections guaranteed him a place at the local manufacturing plant, which has supported our town for decades. However, times changed. The plant stopped hiring people without a degree or trade certificate, regardless of their family ties. His situation worsened when his mother spent all their savings to maintain an unnecessarily lavish lifestyle. My cousin was working as a bus operator, but lost that job and struggled to find another. That's when the girl he met gave him a wake-up call, pointing out how unprepared he was for life due to his privileged upbringing. Her words resonated with him, and he decided to make amends. My sister and I welcomed him back into our lives. He returned to community college, earned a degree, and started working at the plant last August. That's one relationship saved. At his wedding, my aunt, who had a falling out with my father, also wanted to reconcile. Perhaps her son had influenced her decision. She reached out, hoping to talk. While we were cautious, knowing her past behavior, she seemed genuine. We explained that earning back our trust wouldn't be easy. We kept our distance initially, but she made consistent efforts to connect, especially with my niece and nephew, without any signs of malice. While we remain cautious, I want to believe people can change. That's 2 relationships mended. The third is my grandmother, who turns 85 this April. Among her grandchildren, I've always been closest to her, which made it hard to limit contact after our last disagreement. She also had a falling out with my father, who tried to pressure her into signing over her estate to him. When she refused, they argued, and he disappeared from her life for a year, until they crossed paths at my cousin's wedding. At the wedding, my father avoided my sister and me, but approached my brother-in-law to boast about buying a house where he and his mistress were living. Initially, we thought nothing of it since his pension, though reduced by 40%, is still substantial, nearly double my aunt's income. However, after reconciling with my aunt, she revealed he had taken out a loan for the house. To make matters worse, the property deed is in the name of the mistress's eldest son. Realizing he was likely being taken advantage of, we decided it wasn't our concern. Due to some incidents at work, I was offered a more secure and higher-paying position, a rare opportunity I didn't expect for another 3 years. With my increased salary, my mother's divorce settlement, and my sister's help, I managed to put a down payment on a house for my mother and me, despite the soaring housing market. Although I'm now deeply in debt, I'm proud to own a home. My father contributed nothing, and honestly, I wouldn't have accepted his help even if offered. In late November of last year, tragedy struck when my childhood friend, who was very close to my cousin and me, passed away in a car accident. The loss was sudden and devastating. My cousin called me at 2 in the morning to break the news, and before I knew it, I was back home for the funeral. The days leading up to and following the service were some of the darkest I've experienced, and I struggled emotionally. To cope, I decided to stay with my grandmother until after Lunar New Year, hoping the change of scenery and time with her would help. My mother stayed back to look after my niece and nephew, and my sister, living within walking distance, managed things on her end. 7 days after the funeral, my father showed up unannounced at my doorstep. Still grieving, I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I shut down his attempts at pleasantries and stared as he mumbled about traveling and other trivial matters. Then, he brought up a topic that left me stunned. His mistress's second child, a college-bound girl, planned to attend school in my city next summer. She didn't want to live in a dormitory or share an apartment, but insisted on having an entire house to herself. Given that he had already taken out a loan for the stepson's house, he couldn't afford another. To my disbelief, he came to me for money. This is the same man who left my sister in a foreign city to fend for herself when she first went to college. Yet now, he was willing to go to great lengths for a child who isn't even his, and he had the audacity to ask for financial help from me, a son he once claimed he'd rather see dead. I couldn't comprehend his logic. Unfortunately for him, he caught me at the worst possible time. Grieving and emotionally drained, I unleashed every ounce of frustration I had. Words spilled out of me before I even realized what I was saying. Toward the end, my voice cracked under the weight of it all. He tried to argue, but when my aunt and cousin, who live nearby, arrived unexpectedly, he left in a hurry. That encounter was last month, and I haven't heard from him since. Not that I care. That interaction, however, left its mark. It hurts to see my father prioritize someone else's children over his own. I've spent sleepless nights reflecting on it, wondering if we did something wrong or if there's a part of his life so unsatisfying that he sought fulfillment elsewhere. Though I often say I'm over it, deep down, I still hope for a reconciliation someday. I hope he will come to his senses and try to make amends. For now, I remain guarded and more resolute than ever. While I'm not holding my breath, I keep that small hope alive. Work keeps me busy, and I have Lunar New Year preparations to focus on. Life moves forward, even when the past lingers in the shadows. Story 2. When I was 18, late 1990s, I had a silver Amp Spirit with powder blue interior. I didn't know anything about cars, but it was a great little oil-dribbling thing. It had bald tires that would spin the car 360 if I didn't brake cautiously, but I loved it, until it died unexpectedly and I had to have it towed to a shop a week before I was to leave the country for 4 months. I was a kid and didn't know cars, and something major was wrong that I don't remember, but I couldn't afford to fix it. Something like $4,000 to repair. I couldn't afford it and was leaving the country for a while anyway. The mechanic said I could just leave it there, and they would just deal with it or scrap it if I didn't care. Cool. I no longer have a car, but I'm leaving anyway, so who cares? I paid the bill for the work they did and left. When I got home from my many months abroad, I went through a massive stack of mail that included one letter saying the car had been impounded, another that it had been auctioned off, and after the auction date, several parking tickets amounting to about $400. I called the city and asked how I could be liable for parking tickets after the car was auctioned to a new owner. They said it was still in my name. The new owner hadn't changed the title. It was my responsibility. I was furious, but what could I do? The title was in my name, and they couldn't even give me the name of the person who bought it. I had to pay, or it would be sent to collections. So I'm walking to my friend's apartment a block away from my old place and right across the street from her building. I see my car. I still have keys, so I go home and frantically grab them and go back. I get into the car and start pulling all the papers from the glove box and sort through them looking for the new owner's name. Just then, 2 guys run up screaming that I'm in their car, and what do I think I'm doing? I say, "You bought it from auction and didn't change the title. You owe me $400 for the parking tickets in my name." They insist they don't owe me anything. "Not my fault you left it in your name." I smile and calmly start the engine and say, "Okay then, it's in my name, it's legally mine," and drove away. Thanks for repairing the engine. Edit for clarification, I was young and naive. I couldn't afford to have the car towed outside the city, to the house of friends or family. Remember, I was leaving the country for 4 months. There was nowhere off the street in the city to leave it, let alone have it repaired. The mechanic was kind and said he would take it off my hands, which was a relief. But remember the young and naive thing? Yeah. I handed him the title and thought that was all I had to do. The mechanic apparently pushed the car onto the street from where it was impounded. It was then auctioned off by the city. The city gave the title to the new owner. The parking tickets were racked up by the new owner. There were dates on all this paperwork that was mailed to me. I did try to fight the tickets and had a copy of the bill of sale from the auction, but they still said there was nothing they could do because the buyer didn't transfer the title into their name. Back and forth to different government offices, all the while new tickets were being issued. I was pissed that the city didn't have to transfer the title out of my name when they claimed possession of it, but sold it and gave the buyer the title. The same one I handed the mechanic. So it was late last night when I recalled this story and decided to share it on Reddit. But here is a bit I left out. When I got into the car and checked the paperwork in the glove box, I found the title still in my name. They had not even signed it. Also in the glove box was their bill of sale from the auction. They were clearly young and naive too. What happened after? Never heard from them again. I had the car for another year or two, put new tires on it, and sold it properly before another trip abroad. And you better believe I had them sign the title in front of me, and I filed the sale with the DMV that day, giving them I think a week to file or be fined. Story 3. Please note that this story is pre-COVID. This can't be considered petty revenge because I wasn't the target of malice here, and even though this man didn't direct his nonsense at me at the time, he really seemed entitled enough to meet the criteria. I just wanted to clarify this just in case. Time to begin. Right now, I'm feeling proud of myself for doing something wild. This last weekend, my wife and I decided to visit her family. They live in a much larger city than we do, and we go now and again to break up the monotony. On Saturday, my wife and her sister wanted to go shopping at one of the larger malls in the area. Not wanting to do nothing alone, I tagged along. At some point, while listening to their girl talk, I decided to grab a bite, so I told my wife and headed to the food court. At this point, the lunch rush was still going on, so the place was fairly packed. I decided on Chinese food, a place I had been to before, so I trusted that the food was good. So I got in line to wait like anyone else. This particular restaurant was pretty simple. It had 4 cashier lanes and grills behind it, where you could watch the cooks make your order while you wait. But being a Chinese place, it took longer than the typical fast food place, so the lines were moving slowly. While waiting, my phone died. I simply forgot to charge it earlier, so I started watching the crowd to avoid getting bored. Nothing out of the ordinary until I noticed the entitled dad with 2 boys a little bit ahead of me in the line next to me. The 2 boys, maybe around 11 and 9, must have been getting impatient because they would periodically start to screw around or bug the entitled dad, occasionally pushing each other around or asking when they would have food. The entitled dad looked like he was growing more agitated by the minute. Every time he had to turn to deal with these 2, his face grew redder and redder. Understand, dear reader, that this was a busy, loud area, and they weren't being super loud, so they didn't really attract attention yet. I did, however, have to turn away now and again to avoid being noticed though. The trouble started when the entitled dad finally reached his turn. The girl politely did the usual and asked him for his order. But instead of just ordering, the entitled dad started to complain, mainly about how long he and the 2 boys were in line for. She did her best to be polite, but he just kept going for a few minutes. By this time, the gentleman behind the trio was also getting annoyed. He noticed me and gestured to the entitled dad with a "you gotta be kidding me" look. So I just responded with a shrug. As far as I knew, he wasn't wrong. If the entitled dad was in such a hurry, why not just get your food and be done with it? Eventually, the girl at the register was able to get the order. I was now second in place in my line and right next to the 2 kids by this point. I could hear the angry entitled dad go into a tirade about the performance of the restaurant and insist that if it wasn't for his kids wanting it, they would have gone to a better place. About how said Japanese place was better, but because it was currently closed, they had to suffer through this. The entitled dad even started to insult the poor girl behind the counter. The gentleman behind him and the 2 boys tried to tell him off, telling him they are just doing their best, but the entitled dad shot back with the typical "I'm a paying customer so I can do what I want" excuse, and kept going. The girl was obviously growing upset as the entitled dad was bullying her, and I could see tears start to form in her eyes. The entitled dad just wouldn't give her a break. The gentleman behind the trio was also looking like he was getting ready to throw punches. At this moment, I thought that I really wanted to do something, but I didn't want to get into a fight, even if I had backup or ended up being the backup for someone else. That's when I noticed it. The entitled dad was wearing cargo shorts, the kind that never seems to fit right. I thought for a second and found an alternative idea. I found myself just reacting, and the whole thing took only a few seconds. I stepped forward in between the dad and the two kids, grabbed both side loops of the seat of his pants, and yanked as hard as I could. Without stopping, I immediately ran for it. I had to push through a lady in the last line, but I made it. I heard a lot of screaming behind me, but not wanting to get pummeled by an angry, entitled father, I didn't even look back. I ran to the other side of the mall where my wife was still shopping with her sister. I knew my wife enough to predict what stores they would be in. I felt safe enough in a girl's clothing store next to my wife, so after I caught my breath, I just started laughing. My wife asked what happened, and I just told her I would tell her later. I didn't want to spoil their shopping, so I spent the rest of the time keeping an eye out for an angry, entitled dad. I did spot them at one point, now with a blonde lady and a little girl in tow, but that was it. I was lucky enough to avoid them. When we decided to go eat, the lunch rush was pretty much over, and I just had to know. I went back to the Chinese place, and luckily the young girl was still there, so I purposely waited behind an extra person for a chance to talk. When I got the chance, I asked her what happened to the entitled dad. She told me that someone yanked his pants down mid-tirade. The guy who did the deed took off, but the entitled dad couldn't catch him because the gentleman behind him took the opportunity to push him flat on his butt. The gentleman just insisted that he was trying to catch the culprit and missed. Then the entitled dad, being the official center of attention, just grumbled for the rest of the time. He paid and sat down on the opposite side of the food court somewhere. I wanted to laugh, but just in case I never told her. It was me who did the pantsing, even though I really wanted to, so I just took my order and joined my wife and her sister for lunch. I told my wife later, and we had a laugh. She scolded me for pulling such a stunt, but was proud of me for finding such a funny method for helping the cashier. Story 4. Before I begin, here's some background information about the inheritance laws in my country. In my country, if you own land, there are specific restrictions on what you can do with it after your spouse passes away, especially if you have direct heirs like children. For example, let's say you and your spouse jointly own a large piece of land. If your spouse dies and you want to sell the property, you must first provide your children with their rightful share of the inheritance from their deceased parent. This share must be paid at a fair price, meaning the market value. Only after compensating them can you proceed to sell the property. If you cannot or do not do so, you are not allowed to sell. Now, on to the story. My paternal grandmother and her two sisters jointly owned a cabin. By 2006, the eldest sister had passed away, and her share was inherited by her children, who were my dad's cousins. These cousins are not central to the story. This story focuses on my grandmother, my dad, and my grandmother's younger sister, Karen. Karen was the youngest sibling and the golden child of the family. She had a superficially charming demeanor, married into wealth, and was accustomed to always getting her way. She had rarely, if ever, been told no. Karen loved the cabin and spent most weekends there. While my dad's cousins weren't interested in selling their share, Karen had long coveted my grandmother's portion of the property. My grandmother and dad rarely visited the cabin, but my grandmother dutifully contributed her share toward all its maintenance and repairs. Here's some important context about my grandmother. She had never dealt with financial matters. My grandfather had managed everything related to property, taxes, and other financial obligations. After he passed away a few years prior to this incident, my dad had to take over those responsibilities because my grandmother felt too anxious to handle them herself. She had never even given my dad his rightful portion of the inheritance from my grandfather. Karen was well aware of this situation. Additionally, my grandmother had been battling cancer for several years by then. Although it wasn't aggressively progressing, she was physically weakened and emotionally fragile. Medication helped her maintain comfort, but she was generally a very anxious person. In the winter of 2006, Karen visited my grandmother and stayed overnight, which was unusual for her. A few days later, my dad called my grandmother for a chat. During the conversation, my grandmother mentioned Karen's visit and casually added that they had reached an agreement regarding the cabin. She explained that Karen had brought over some papers for her to sign. Alarmed, my dad asked, "What papers? It wasn't the deed, was it?" To his shock, my grandmother confirmed that it was. She went on to explain that Karen had come over, expressed her desire to purchase my grandmother's share of the cabin, and brought the deed with her, all ready for signing. When Karen asked for a price, my grandmother, who knew nothing about property values or finances, suggested $3,000. While the actual currency was different, that amount roughly equates to today's value in dollars. My dad was furious not only because that figure was far below the property's actual worth, but also because of Karen's manipulative tactics. Karen had essentially ambushed my grandmother, staying overnight to ensure she controlled the situation and prevented my grandmother from calling my dad for advice. Although my dad wasn't against the idea of selling the share to Karen, he insisted it must be at market value, something Karen was well aware of. My dad immediately called Karen to confront her. He made it clear that the sale was unacceptable and that he intended to contest it. Karen defended herself, claiming that this was what my grandmother wanted, that my grandmother had set the price, and that she had done nothing wrong. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, my dad quickly hired a lawyer, and Karen did the same. They spent the entire spring and summer in a legal back and forth. My dad refused to back down, while Karen continued to insist she had every right to the cabin. Meanwhile, my grandmother was deeply distressed. To her, a family feud was the worst thing imaginable. She pleaded with my dad to let the matter go, but he stood firm, determined to protect his inheritance. By the beginning of 2007, the case went to trial. The proceedings only lasted a few hours. According to my parents, the judge harshly reprimanded Karen. The sale was deemed a blatant violation of inheritance laws and was ruled null and void. Ownership of the cabin was transferred back to my grandmother. My mother later told me that Karen entered the courtroom brimming with confidence, certain she was in the right. However, as the judge reviewed the documents and questioned her, Karen's demeanor visibly crumbled. By the end, she hung her head in defeat. Tragically, just a week after the trial, my grandmother passed away. Karen did not attend the funeral. Before this ordeal, Karen and my dad had a good relationship. However, they never spoke again after the trial. Following my grandmother's passing, my dad decided to sell his share of the cabin, but selling it to Karen was completely out of the question. Instead, he approached his cousins, explained the entire situation, and proposed selling his share to them. Thankfully, they were interested and purchased it at a fair price. After her legal defeat and the loss of the sister she had attempted to manipulate, Karen rarely visited the cabin. It seemed the bitter outcome had left her disenchanted. For the first time in her life, she had been told a firm no. This was something she truly wanted, but she didn't get her way, and the experience clearly stung. There isn't a happy ending to this story, but it serves as a cautionary tale. Greed and entitlement can ruin opportunities and destroy family relationships. Story 5. I used to work as a shift manager for a pizza franchise across a handful of local locations. I closed most nights at one location or another, which usually meant I was alone inside the store after dinner any time the drivers were delivering. This meant answering the phone, working the register, and making all the pizzas while we were still open. One day I got robbed, and the owners changed the policies on how much cash could be in the register and how frequent drops into the safe had to happen. I did not have the ability to open the safes, only deposit into them using a special one-way door. One night we had several cash orders with large bills that left my register a little lean, which was a rare occurrence. No problem, the dinner rush is over and statistically I should be totally fine. In walks customer for a pickup. He wants to pay for a $1.11 order in cash with a $100 bill. Normally this would be fine, but I had just been wiped out of my 20s and had all of maybe $50 between the 1s/5s/10s. The 50s and 100s got directly dropped into the safe under the new policy. I'm sorry, I don't have enough change for a $100 bill right now. Do you have anything smaller or a card? I asked. He had a $20 bill in his wallet that I caught a glimpse of when he opened it. What do you mean? The customers asked. I had a lot of cash orders for dinner, and the register basically got wiped out. The customer then says in a condescending tone, "Okay, so get more change like from the safe or something. I'm sure you can figure this out." I don't have access to the safe or a means to get change right now. I'm sorry about that. I don't see how you're making this my problem. Send someone to the bank or an ATM. I'm really sorry, it's just me and the bank's closed, but there's an ATM across the street in the convenience store if you want to use it. I said you should go to an ATM. This is ridiculous. I apologize for the inconvenience. I can't leave the store and the corporate does not issue bank cards to in-store employees. However, some good news is that I think you might have overlooked a $20 bill in your wallet. For some reason, this set him off. "Why are you looking in my wallet?" He launched off into this speech about minding my own business and $100 bills being legal tender and must be accepted. I had placed another order in the oven before walking to the register, and at this point those other pizzas were exiting the oven conveyor and were at risk of falling. This also means that we've been talking for about 7 minutes by this point. I want to reiterate that I am by no means refusing to accept, just implying you would be significantly shortchanged if I tried to do so. Your $11 order would end up being a $50 order. I think you're bluffing, and you can easily get what you need out of your safe. You just get your kicks by getting to assert your power because you can't do better than minimum wage. If you can't break this bill, then just cancel my order. Listen, I've tried to be polite. You're not really working with me here, and I need to box other orders now. I can't open the safe. I said the same thing to the last person who asked. He had a gun to my forehead, and he was even less friendly than you. If you would like to cancel the order, then I can do that. While I can't open the safe, I can most certainly eat your dinner. He found the $20 bill. Story 6. To summarize quickly, I was doing online work that needed to be completed within a strict time limit and required my full attention. Before starting, I went outside to feed the stray cats that were waiting at my doorstep. After feeding them, I got to work. Everything was going fine until my mom asked me to clean up something. I explained that I was busy and would take care of it once I was done, keeping in mind the time limit. At this point, everything seemed okay. Despite being pressed for time, I briefly cleaned the area she mentioned. I didn't do a thorough job but tried to address it quickly, knowing I would likely need to go over it again later. Once again, everything seemed fine. I eventually finished my work, though it took longer than expected because I struggle with attention and motivation. Just as I finished and headed toward the kitchen, I remembered I hadn't fully addressed the cleaning task. Then, all at once, it happened. My mom stood in front of me with an intimidating, angry expression. She started yelling and scolding me, saying I hadn't done what she asked. I quickly realized that I had accidentally left a fork on the couch, which I had used to feed the cats. I immediately apologized, explaining that I hadn't noticed because I was focused on my work. I tried to explain myself and apologize repeatedly, but she ignored me and continued shouting. I told her I was genuinely trying to improve and do better, but she dismissed it, insisting I hadn't tried hard enough. As I kept apologizing to diffuse the situation, she only grew angrier, raising her voice and swearing at me. I told her several times that I didn't appreciate being called names or insulted. She had called me words like witch and other offensive terms, which hurt deeply. Despite my protests, she refused to stop. At one point, she accused me of being her abuser. I was completely taken aback. She said I had mistreated her ever since I was a toddler, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. To provide some context, here are some of the things my mom has done to me over the years to illustrate how hypocritical her accusations were. As far back as I can remember, I was emotionally mistreated. I was called names and cursed at even as a young child. Discipline wasn't just about spankings. It often involved extreme measures. I was stripped down and hit, sometimes in front of others. One of the worst incidents was being hit with a long extension cord outside. Another time, she pinned me down and punished me. Punishments extended beyond my home life. In first grade, a teacher subjected us to harsh and humiliating punishments, including making us hold heavy crates of books for long periods. This teacher even allowed one student to be physically disciplined by their parent in front of the class. During Black History Month, she suggested black students dress as slaves, which was deeply offensive and degrading. My mother also devised her own punishments. She made me stand on one leg or in an uncomfortable position for what felt like hours while she slept. We weren't allowed to move until she said we could stop. At the age of 12, I was kicked out of the house twice, totaling 4 weeks. I was sent to a group home, which was essentially like a prison. We weren't allowed to leave except for school, had no access to phones or technology, and underwent daily security checks. While they occasionally took us to the movies or paid us for chores, it didn't compensate for the restrictions. I was confined to a room with another child and only permitted to leave for basic needs. I was forced into therapy for reasons my mom fabricated in official paperwork. She accused me of lying to hurt others and made other false claims without consulting me. Twice, I was sent to therapy after being caught using my school Chromebook when I wasn't supposed to. Both times, I was forced to pack my belongings while sobbing and dropped off at the location, all before I turned 12. My mom has consistently invaded my privacy. She went through my notebooks and drawings, mocking them in front of relatives without my permission. On one occasion, she stood over me while flipping through a personal notebook, criticizing its contents. It was one of the few outlets I had to cope, and I felt completely helpless. She often threatened to destroy my belongings. There was even a time she silently watched me drawing in my room in the dark, only to yell at me when she saw what I was creating. One of the most traumatic experiences involved her threatening my siblings and me with a gun. Although she later claimed it wasn't loaded, the fear was real. She forced us to do physical exercises, such as sit-ups and push-ups, while holding the weapon. This was all because someone had used her soap. In middle school, if my room was messy, she would throw everything onto the floor, leaving a chaotic pile for me to clean up. I'd come home to this disaster and have to pick up every item. My childhood was steeped in religious trauma, as I was raised in an environment that could be described as a cult. These examples barely scratch the surface, but they highlight the environment I grew up in. When my mom accused me of mistreating her as a toddler, it was the breaking point. I completely lost my composure and had a mental meltdown. I started screaming, overwhelmed by years of pent-up emotions and the absurdity of her accusations. Her reaction was swift and harsh. She shouted, "You're not going to do that in my house. Go scream outside." Then she kicked me out. I was wearing only pajamas and socks, with no shoes. It was freezing outside, with snow still on the ground from a recent blizzard. I sat on the porch, crying and shivering, while she left me out there for 30 minutes. She came out briefly to warn me never to say I hated her again. She claimed she already knew I hated her, but I had finally said it aloud. This wasn't even true. She had provoked me to say it after relentless yelling. When she eventually let me back in, I ran to my room, burying my face in tears. That was yesterday. Since then, she hasn't apologized, asked how I was, or even acknowledged what happened. I don't hate her as a person, but I despise her actions, which I find despicable. She refuses to acknowledge or take responsibility for what she does. I believe she deliberately provokes me to feel a sense of power and control. She projects her dissatisfaction with life onto me and my siblings, using us as scapegoats for her anger. I suspect she was already upset and looking for an excuse to lash out. When she found a minor mistake, she used it to validate her outburst. I'm done. I'm focusing on finding a job and leaving this toxic environment. Once I move out, I plan to go no contact with her. I won't involve the authorities. Instead, I'll give her what she seems to want. She frequently asks when I'll leave, and I'll honor that as soon as I can. Though I struggle with finding work due to my disability, I'm determined to move out. When I do, I won't look back. I won't contact her, and I'll ensure she faces the consequences of her actions, whether it's the loneliness of a nursing home or the silence of no one reaching out. Her behavior has already alienated me, and I refuse to let it dictate my future any longer.